Well, look, let's get on to some real news where there is legitimate cause for concern. Hong Kong is the metaphor. Remember in the protest last year against Chinese suppression and the crushing of the pro-democracy voices? In the little Hong Kong, 7.5 million people, 8,000 were arrested. That's equivalent to arresting 27,000 in Australia. I've said before, the values of Western civilisation are under siege, not just geopolitically. Do Australians know what's being taught in the classroom and the lecture theatre? Marxist crap about gender fluidity, a boy can be a girl and a girl can be a boy. Look where we are in identity politics. It's not about how good you are, but it's now about gender and race and skin colour. Have a look at these protests. Tragically, Afro-Americans are killed, but 89.5% of them are not killed by white police, but by Afro-Americans. 89.5%. Jacinta Price, the outstanding Indigenous academic, has said, and I quote, Aboriginal Australians are far more likely to die at the hands of other Aboriginal Australians than at the hands of white people or in custody. But these protests are designed to undermine and then in the end destroy society as we know it, and our Hong Kong friends are feeling it. They're well-educated, enterprising and peace-loving. They've had a taste of freedom and democracy. They know the China risk. It's a pity we don't. China's imposed new national security laws on Hong Kong. They've already arrested people just for possessing a sign promoting independence. Bring out the water cannons, the pepper sprays and the tear gas. Well, thank God for Donald Trump. He has stepped up his confrontation with China over the South China Sea by formally declaring most of its disputed territorial claims in the region are illegal. So the legitimate call goes out to hear sympathetically the wave of asylum claims from Hong Kong Chinese. But Hong Kong nationals living in Australia are urging the Morrison government to undertake strict political vetting of those fleeing the territory, fearing Chinese Communist Party supporters could take advantage of Scott Morrison's resettlement offer. Well, enter the remarkable Catherine McGregor. Amongst everything else, she's a former RAAF and Army officer and works as an advisor at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. She makes a million valid points, but one that is alarmingly pertinent. She says, quote, since the end of the Napoleonic Wars, states have avoided direct conventional warfare, preferring to achieve their aim through proxies. Well, here we are today. Witness the massive damage to the economy. Where did the virus come from? Can we put two and two together? Can we now expect China to take real advantage of our economic vulnerability? Is this the destruction of our strength by proxy? You love this woman. Here she is from Canberra in the studios. Catherine, good evening. Lovely to talk to you. Achieving aims through
Great
proxies.
To talk to you, Alan.
Achieving aims through proxies. Is this game on?
Well, neither Russia nor China actually view peace and war as binary constructs the way we in the West do. Ever since the Russian operations in Crimea, they've become very adept at what they call hybrid war, grey zone warfare. China's military doctrine reflects this. They're quite transparent about it. They look at the full domain of strategic competition between states as game on. So those kinds of cyber intrusions we had in the last couple of weeks, to which the PM alluded, that was quite clearly a Chinese operation directed at Australian infrastructure. There are a number of nation states that operate this way. They do it also in the South China Sea, where they've not only brazenly militarised those islands that now been named by Secretary Pompeo, and were also, that claim was repudiated at the International Court of Arbitration at The Hague in 2016. But they have operated in this manner now for some time. They operate what they call full spectrum operations. That's soft power political influence. We've seen elements of that in Australia through the Confucius Institutes, through the compromising of politicians, through donations and influence peddling. And we'll expect to see more of it. It's actually straight out of the playbook.
Yeah, Catherine, you cite this historian and researcher and military historian, Azar Gatt, and War and Peace. He writes about War and Peace. He says that war is on decline, but nonetheless, with Russia and Crimea and the Ukraine and China, you've just mentioned the South China Sea, now Hong Kong, do you see similarities here with the 1930s?
Absolutely. And look, I know Azar through the Changing Character of War program at Oxford, which I had the great privilege of attending a decade or so ago. And he's a formidable historian. He's written from an anthropological perspective about the evolution of warfare since people lived in caves. So he's taken a panoramic view. But the one thing he said is that he's detected two trends, Alan, that are very, very alarming. One is that ever since the Napoleonic Wars, conventional state warfare has been in relative decline. Now, that seems to defy common sense when we look at the news and see imagery of refugees and warfare all over the place. But the fact is, state-on-state warfare has been in relative decline. However, when it does occur, it is much more catastrophic, and we saw that with the introduction of nuclear weapons. Now, the point about the 1930s that he makes is valid. That is the last time that the global system tried to accommodate two rising totalitarian capitalist nations, namely Nazi Germany and Japan, which were vaguely capitalist but totalitarian. We've now got two revisionist sort of capitalist powers, quasi-capitalist powers, but they're definitely totalitarian in Russia and China. And they make no mistake whatsoever that they regard the very existence of liberal democracy as destabilising, innately destabilising to their model.
Could I just say the point that when Western Australian Liberal Andrew Hastie's an outstanding man, I think, said that last year, I mean, you wrote of his critics, you said most of them would prefer to fight the Army of Northern Virginia, or at least statues commemorating it. But you rightly say that his critics are keyboard warriors who think, and I quote your words, the greatest threat to our liberty is Rupert Murdoch, not President Xi. And you say we're on the edge of an abyss where the great liberal democratic project of the past 3 centuries may well be replaced by totalitarianism. Catherine, how big is the risk and how immediate?
I think it's real. I think it's immediate. I'm proud to call Andrew Hastie a friend, I might add. I think he's a terrific fellow and one to watch. And he made that analogy, was piled on and called a warmonger. But they were calling Reagan a warmonger in 1964 when he spoke at the Republican convention, and he ended up being the president who told them to tear down that wall. Look, my worry, Alan, in the immediate term, is that China is perhaps wrongly interpreting the crisis currently in the United States with the pandemic and the outbreak of violence over Black Lives Matters and so on. I think they do consider the US as in terminal decline. I think the US is still the indispensable and a remarkable power, and it has regenerative capacity. But they may do something rash. There's all sorts of signs that they could do something to coincide with the presidential election cycle. I know I share that view with Jim Molan, and there are others in the national security apparatus who are concerned that around November, or certainly ahead of the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party, there could be some kind of cross-straits coercion, if not direct action against Taiwan. So that's imminent, and it's very, very scary because they've never hidden their long-term intention to reincorporate the so-called wayward province.
It's great to talk to you. Just before we go, though, and we won't have time to answer this, but I'd like to take this point up with you next week. If what we are talking about is being fought by proxy, question to contemplate, what are we doing about what's happening in the classroom and the lecture theatre? What do we do about people like the Archbishop of Canterbury, who tells white Christians to repent for their racial sins? And in all of this, the nation's leaders are silent. Catherine.
Yeah, well, we back Drew Pavlou and others like him, mate. That's the first place. That's where we start.
Yeah, good on you. Good to talk to you. We'll talk again next week.
Good to you.
Thank you so much. That's Catherine McGregor. I just repeat the point I made earlier this week, that the Western Sydney University has written to each of its staff, this is what's going on in universities, and students, urging them to sign up to the Western Sydney University Black Lives Matter pledge. I'll raise this with Catherine next week. The Vice-Chancellor has given his full support. Most of the staff have signed. There's no historical context or detail about what the students are being asked to endorse. I think this is the war by proxy that Azar Gat is talking about.